Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine and I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center's furthest outpost from Abilene, Texas. Currently joining you from Antananarivo, Madagascar, where I am on sabbatical, but still doing a couple things to help you ring in the end of the semester. So today we're going to be doing a webinar called EdD in Progress, Crafting an Original Case Study Analysis. Now, there are other webinars in our catalog that look at different parts of writing your analysis, but less so on writing the case study itself, which is part of what you'll be doing. You'll be writing up the case study and then analyzing it. And there's some, shall we say, areas of interest in how you exclude and include information depending on what you are trying to convince your reader of. And we'll talk that more in a little bit. We're pretty late into the semester, so you're probably familiar with our operations already, but if you're watching this for the first time and wondering how do you come to the Writing Center, you can work with us through a variety of channels, including by attending webinars such as this, watching our catalog on our website, by setting up an asynchronous appointment where you schedule a time and send us your draft by that time, or with the phone or Zoom appointment where you send us an email and request to meet at one of a range of times, and we see if we can match you up with our schedule. We have information about this and other resources on the Online Writing Center website, and because this is near the end of the semester, we're going to go ahead and move to the main content for today. Oh, one more thing. If you are looking at this webinar and wondering what else we have added last term a program-specific webinar guide. This is on the main Writing Center webinar page. You scroll down past the calendar and you'll see this set of tabs here. And if you select the tab for Lead EdD, you will find a list of all the webinars that we have that tie in directly with specific webinars in this program. Now, if you are in another program and you're looking for something with yours, for example, if you're in HCAD, just click on that tab. If you're in the nursing program, click on that one. And we update these as we add new webinars. So if you don't see it at the start of the semester, but you do see it's on the calendar, we'll add it once the webinar has been offered. All right, you will see me using the APA course paper template at the end of this. If you want to grab it now, you can go to the Online Writing Center website, and I'll remind you about that when we get to it. Our main learning objectives today, we are going to first talk about the purpose of case studies and case study research. We will delve into the Week 7 case study assignment for Leadership 724. We'll review a couple points of key content, and we'll finish with drafting and outlining. And just a reminder, as with all of our assignments, if you reach the assignment description and you realize that you don't remember or you have not encountered some of the material first yet, it is always a good idea to go back and revisit the reading to make sure you understand the key concepts, because you will get more out of reading the assignment instructions the first time if you know what it's referencing, if you understand what it's talking about. All right, let's talk about the purpose of case studies and case study research. Well, what is a case study? One definition for this is a research approach that is used to generate an in-depth, multifaceted understanding of a complex issue in its real-life context. Now, there are what we call artificial case studies, where you describe a scenario to illustrate a point. But most case studies are grounded in real-life actual experience, something that happened at an institution, between individuals, perhaps in an industry, and using that description as a basis for understanding some other concept, whether it is practicing the screening of information to apply a theory and make a decision, whether it is to understand a phenomenon in action, or something else. And what that particular issue or phenomenon is going to vary a lot, and we'll talk about how, in the assignment we're looking at today, how the instructions actually give suggestions about what kind of case study you should be writing. Now, what are case studies used for? Well, a lot of things, including generating ideas, gaining an understanding of the subject, isolating details for comparison, diluting potential bias by discussing something that's not directly related to the people involved. You know, if you were trying to psychoanalyze your, we'll say your sibling or your spouse, you are probably not an unbiased observer there. And by having some distance, by talking about something that's not your specific company, or by removing some of the details to look at it in a slightly more abstract way as a case study, it's a way to reduce and dilute potential bias. And as you've seen in the leadership program so far, a great reason for using case studies is to illustrate theories, models, and other constructs by applying them to real-world or a real-world type example situation. Now, we do have several webinars about different aspects of case studies. You can find these all on our online catalog of webinars. But let's move now into talking about the particular purpose of a case study analysis. Because you can write up a case study, but there's a separate step when you analyze it to show what meanings can be taken from it. And often this is about role-playing decision processes. Sometimes it's about identifying a phenomenon or patterns of behavior. Very often it's about understanding or explaining some complex phenomena in the natural or real-world setting. And sometimes you're trying to generate generalizable conclusions. Before we move forward on that one, something to keep in mind is what stage of research you're at right now, because that generalizable conclusions thing, if you're doing case study research for your dissertation, you're definitely going to want those. For the purposes of this assignment, well, it may not be something that you are actually required to do. So keep in mind what is the goal of this particular analysis, because there can be many different goals for case study analyses in general. All right, so a little bit about case study research. One of the hallmarks of case study research is that while data is being collected, or sets of data are being collected, the conditions aren't being manipulated by the researcher. You're not going in and saying, okay, well, in this case, I took 10 people and stranded them on an island, and 10 people I stranded on this other island, and I gave alligators for one, and granola bars on the other. You're not doing an experiment. You're not manipulating the conditions here. That doesn't mean you might not be involved in some way in perhaps at the company where this happened and you were able to observe it as an insider, but you're generally not changing things that are going on. Now, the data that are collected, it's maybe very general and descriptive, talking, oh, so-and-so is an employee at this company, but they do sometimes include specific artifacts, like you have a policy memo, or an internal report on something, or you might introduce something like industry statistics to show this is a broad phenomenon or a rare phenomenon, and other information like that. Just because it's a case study doesn't mean that you're limited by the types of data that you might be collecting. It's just a question of what is going to be relevant to the purpose of this case study. Now, an important thing about case studies is setting boundaries. Now, you might ask, well, what do you mean by boundaries? Think of it like we're drawing a box around the case study. And inside the box, there are the things that are relevant to what you're doing, and so you write about those. And then outside the box, there are things that are not relevant, because there's going to be a whole lot of information available on this thing that you're writing about. But what you include in the case will help determine how lessons are drawn from it. Because if you include a lot of distracting detail that the reader needs to sift through, they may be misled by that. Or if you don't include enough detail on something, or detail on something at all, they might conclude incorrectly that something is not an issue. Now, the boundaries that you set are very helpful for you as a writer, because they help you determine where to go in depth and where to be more brief. And the main determinant of what is going to be relevant, what is within the boundaries of the case study, what you include in the case study description, is the purpose that you have for writing the case study. Now, it's certainly true that some classic case studies have been reanalyzed for different purposes, using different perspectives, tools, and things. But let's not get so complicated here. What is your reader going to be able to do with this case study? What do you want them to be able to do? To understand, to learn, to explore, to apply something. And that will help determine what details should go into this. So let's talk about some example boundaries for a single case study. This is when you have one case study that you're discussing as opposed to comparing multiple case studies. Well, let's say you were writing about an internal office conflict between coworkers. Because of this, most of the details are probably going to focus on the office setting, the people involved, and any sort of relevant internal or external factors. If the corporate office has sent in a memo saying that there are going to be layoffs and only the best employees will be retained, you can imagine that this will cause some conflict as people try and not get cut in that situation. Now, on the other hand, limited, if any, reference will be getting made to other offices people beyond the, HR's announced that there are going to be some firings. Now, let's say we were doing a single case study about hiring within a company. Now, because it's within that company, there's probably going to be a bit more detail on perceived priorities and requirements. What do we want these employees to have, or what do these specific people think that they should have? Certainly some discussion of the key applicants' relevant qualifications. Do you need to discuss all of them or all of them in detail? No, you could say that there were 12 candidates, however, 4 were shortlisted by X group. And while you might list some of the criteria that led to those 4 people being on the short list, you don't really need to go into a lot of detail about the 8 unless your case study is about that exclusion, in which case, go to town on it. Now, you might have a discussion of the hiring personnel's contrasting priorities. That's actually a very interesting and very common situation where not everyone on the hiring committee is looking for the same thing. And that may influence what's going on. And certainly if that's the case where they're not all on 100% on board with each other for the same priorities, where they may evaluate the candidates differently because of their particular biases and interests there. Now, if you are focusing on hiring within a company, it's not that you can't refer to other companies or industries, but there's probably going to be limited referring to them, except for a quick comparison. For example, if you noted, other companies within the industry have this problem, sure, you just talked about the industry to give a little context, but would you go into great detail about the company next door, how they do their hiring? Well, you'd have to give a very strong rationale for why that would be relevant if you're focusing on your company's internal hiring processes. If there's something like, all these people used to work there, okay, but you need to make that clear and make that arc that they are connected. All right, continuing on here. Let's talk about the specific assignment. This is Leadership 724's Week 7 case study assignment toward mutual solutions for complex conflicts. Now, the instructions for this assignment I've reformatted slightly just to make it clear how they break into different portions of information. This assignment asks you to describe a challenging conflict related to a leadership and diversity issue, and to design a detailed approach toward mutual solutions for this conflict. The solution must incorporate at least 3 structures from Moore-Barrack 2017's levels 1 through 4, and they have to be appropriate to the identified problem. It must also incorporate concepts from these specific chapters in the Moore-Barrack text, and the mutual obligation solutions described by Emerson and Yancey. And then there's this set of more formal instructions. So we had the big picture here, and now we have the details on what you're supposed to write and in what order. To describe the identified conflict in detail, including the context and at least 2 conflicting perspectives about what's wrong, and to include a brief review of any previous attempts to resolve the conflict. So if you're reading this now, you should be thinking, okay, so this has to be a conflict that people have tried to solve before, or indicative of something that people have tried to solve before. If it's entirely new for the organization, this has never happened, probably not a good case study write-up for this assignment. You want something that, as the instructions say, that there's been some previous attempt to resolve this, which will let you talk about, okay, well, what's an issue here? Now, you're also supposed to select 3 structures from Moore Barrack that are appropriate to the conflict that you have identified. The structures here referring to the different levels, and to design resolution plans that will bring these to the identified conflict. So there's must be something that needs to be changed here in some way. And the note about you may need to stretch your perspective to see the problem beyond a single organization. Well, remember that these different levels involve different tiers of problems and solutions. You can have something that is a problem in between an organization and the community it's embedded in, for example, and that's going to be different than if you're just looking at a problem within the organization itself. Continuing on, explain how the principles outlined in the reading strengthen your plan, include discussion of a few key terms, the diversity paradox, decoupling, organizational climate, and to also include a statement connecting the identified conflict to its global context. So that tells you that you should be writing about something that is not wholly specific to your company. Another way to understand this is that you should not be exploring an isolated issue. We're looking at something that has a connection and may even result from the global context. You're also asked to describe an alternate plan from the mutual obligations approach. So you could follow the approach from Emerson and Yancey, but an alternate approach, okay, what else might you do, or what might you do differently? And you need to specifically describe how their proposed methodology informs your approach. Now, one of the reasons you want to be very specific about answering these directly first, and then following up with more detail, is that this is only a 4 to 6 page essay. And that's not counting the cover page, not counting the references. This is 4 to 6 pages of body. And you could easily write a 6-page paper on one of these things, but it's important to keep in mind what is the purpose of this, and to start by giving the reader what they need, i.e. what the assignment says must be there first, and then you can expand further. So let's take a look at the grading rubric here. We see that there is much of what we saw before in the instructions, just presented a little differently. We have, that is 20% of the grade going to describing the real-world conflict in detail, including context and at least 2 conflicting perspectives, briefly reviewing the previous attempts to resolve the conflicts or noting their absence. All right. Identifying the 3 structures and the resolution plans. That is going to be a large percentage. That's 25 percentage points for the grade coming from there. So that should be a little bit longer than the previous section. Another 20% going to describing the general principles in the selected reading bits and how that applying them here will strengthen your plans to apply these levels of structure to help address the conflict. And also the discussion of those specific terms and the connection to the global context. Another 20% going to having that alternate solution, and the rest of that is is it long enough? Is it meeting basic APA formatting, etc., etc. So the largest portion of the points here, and by that I mean 85% of the grade, comes from do you have the specific content that is laid out to be included here? Okay, great. Now let's continue through here, and let's talk about some of those key bits of content that you're supposed to include. Now we'll start with Moore Barrack's level of workplace inclusion, but there are a few other things we'll talk about as well. So those levels of workplace inclusion, we have level 1, that's the inclusion through diversity within the work organization. By the way, work is treated broadly here. It does not necessarily mean, say, salaried employees at a particular workplace. It could be something like a church where there are people engaged in different capacities, some of them volunteer, some of them not. It could be a membership organization. These take a very flexible definition of workplace. Level 2 is inclusion through corporate community collaborations. This could involve the corporation and the town it's located in, or it could involve the professional society, perhaps. Inclusion through national or state level collaborations. Now, with professional societies, that's something that can fit into level 2, level 3. It kind of depends on how large they are, and are we talking about the regional office or chapter or the national one, and how much sway do they have. And level 4 is going to be inclusion through international collaborations. Now, you might note from looking at the assignment instruction, the rubric, that these levels are described in detail in chapters 13 through 16. And if we look at the instructions here for the third item in the rubric, it's talking about using principles in chapters 11, 17, and 18. So make sure that you check those chapters and make sure that you are, in fact, using material from them when you get to that section. Because while these 4 levels where conflict can occur are certainly present and will be discussed as part of the second item in the rubric, there are separate things that you need to make sure that you cover in the third part. All right, continuing. So some of those are assignment relevant chapters. Well, let's take a look at them. Chapter 11, that's the chapter on unlocking diversity potential using inclusive leadership. Chapter 17, that is the practical steps for creating an inclusive workplace. A chapter about climate for diversity and inclusion and survey scales, and it specifically mentions 2 scales that can be used to help measure things. Chapter 18, that's moving into global workplaces and how to integrate the things that were discussed in the rest of the book. And let's spend a moment on some of those key terms, like the diversity paradox. Now, the diversity paradox has a couple related meanings and some contextual definitions. You will find many, but go with the one that's defined in the book. Broadly speaking, the diversity paradox describes different aspects of this central phenomenon where it has been found in multiple studies that teams that are more diverse are more likely to have better decisions than a team that is not diverse. But there's a flip side, and this is why it's a paradox rather than the diversity blessing or the diversity bounty. The flip side is that even though they come up with better decisions, they tend to be a little bit less confident and less certain. And if you think about that, well, if you had 100 people from the same background, they're more likely to come up with the same suggestion for something. If all 100 people in the group, 100% of the people involved are saying the same thing, well, you'd probably be pretty confident about that. So, now, if it's not right, it's not right. But in order to execute something well, you often need a bit of confidence in that decision and to be able to follow through well. You might also be familiar with the diversity innovation paradox, which is applying the diversity paradox to the context of innovation. In this case, we'll talk about it in higher education. Because in higher education, the diversity innovation paradox refers to demographically underrepresented students. So, it depends on your institution, but if we go for the U.S. as a whole, that's going to be, for example, Native Americans, Hispanics, and people of African descent, and are historically underrepresented in American colleges. Now, if we were going to a region or an institution where this is not the normal case there, where they have a minority student body that is demographically underrepresented, well, you might have more trouble spotting this having issues for them within that institution, but if you take it out to the global scale, they may run into this problem at some other thing, whether it's a national conference or submitting to journal articles or something else like that. Now, decoupling. This is a helpful one. It comes from industrial contexts like decoupling train cars, where you detach one so your locomotive doesn't take the car you've removed away. Decoupling when it happens intentionally, great, not a problem. Decoupling when it happens accidentally, like you're going down the track and you lose the cars that you're dragging, That's not great, especially if there's some other train coming on the track, or if they're heading towards a hill or heading down on a hill, which is very bad. So decoupling is when we have, in this sort of discussion, it's when you have policies and practices that are not in alignment, where the policy says do this, but people don't actually do it, and that gives us decreased effectiveness. And decoupling can be sensed or perceived as being there by employees, and whether it's actual or perceived as may have the same outcome in the end, so it's something to be on the watch for. Now, organizational climate, this is something that's come up in earlier assignments, but just to briefly revisit, we're talking about patterns that aren't just one-time things that keep coming back or are there all along. Patterns and perceptions about things like attitudes, behaviors, and feelings that take place within a structured environment. So it's not an employee's general happiness, but it's, what is perceived and what is actually happening in the office. So if the person perceives the organizational climate as being hostile to them, that it doesn't support their professional development or advancement or their retention, that's not great. And even if the employers are trying to do something, if what is perceived is not a positive organizational climate for that employee, then there are negative consequences to that, often including increased attrition. Global context, I don't think we need to spend too much time on this. There's a lot that's been covered in the program already about how interconnected the world is and how people are increasingly looking at their situation within the world rather than their situation within a small corner of the world, and that pertains to a number of other things as well, including but not limited to what they want and what they perceive other people as getting. And part of that is that people increasingly have and express, so we can see them, multiple identities. They may also have other identities, perhaps on the internet, that we don't see, but still factor into things. I'm reminded of a meeting I was at about 3 years ago, where someone made a remark about quote-unquote Chinese people. Now, I happen to be half Chinese, and someone on the other side of the desk immediately looked at me to see how I would react, and because they were worried that I was very offended. Would that have taken place as, 20, 25 years ago? Well, it might have. But it's something where increasingly people are aware of how huge China's economy has become, how Chinese, native-born Chinese and Chinese descent are spreading across the globe and are increasingly your coworkers in different contexts. And whether that is something that is important to them or important to you or important to the person down the hall, that is part of the increasingly more diverse and more interconnected global context that so many of these things are embedded in. And they can change things in all sorts of ways that are not necessarily perceived or perceptible to everyone involved. Briefly, let's take a quick look at the Emerson and Yancey book. So this is Transcending Racial Barriers Towards a Mutual Obligations Approach, and that tells you a lot about the thrust of the book. But take a quick look at the chapter and think about what pieces you might want or need to use when you are fulfilling the assignment requirements. I am going to give you a particular nudge to make sure that you review Chapter 10, not just because it's at the end, because it's talking about how do we solve things rather than just where do we go from here, and, what are some, small-scale solutions. This is how to move the big picture forward in a positive direction. All right, some reminders before we start the outlining. Make sure that you answer each prompt directly and then respond in detail. Make sure that you use the language and phrasing of the prompt so it's clear that you're responding to that specific prompt. And use consistent word choices to refer to the same things. This is going to come up especially when you're describing conflicts, to make sure that you are not confusing the reader about how many things are not working as well as desired. Make sure that you use the rubric and instructions together to come up with approximate headings and level of organization and section lengths. And in this particular assignment, I would add that I recommend you interpret suggestions made in the instructions as requirements, as things that you should make sure you put in to get full credit. And at this point, we should grab a copy of the APA course paper template. So if you don't have this in front of you, I recommend pausing the video so that you can download a copy and then just resume when you have that ready in front of you. And I have here a blank copy of the course paper template here, ready to start filling things in. And the very first thing that I recommend doing is to put in the two sources that you know without a doubt you are going to be citing, because they are mentioned in the assignment instructions. Now, I often see students just copy and pasting out of the syllabus, and that's a great way to save some time, but make sure that you proofread it. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change this to match the destination formatting. So we have some of the formatting we're looking for. I'm going to take off these bullets, and we'll replace that with a hanging indent formatting. Now let's take a closer look and make sure that we have only the information that we need for APA 7. And getting rid of the ISBN number, that's not part of APA style. And if you're particularly eagle-eyed, you might have spotted the two additional things that need to be done. First, we need a space between those initials. And second of all, this entry actually goes first because our references order should be sorted alphabetically by first author's last name. So Emerson and Yancey goes before Morbarek. All right, so we know that those sources are going to be cited, so we have them in, and now what I recommend doing is copy and pasting the assignment instructions right from the website. All right, so we have these instructions pasted in here, and the first thing I want to do is to go in and start crossing off things that are not needed. And one of these I'm going to do is going to change this, per my suggestion earlier, from a politely worded suggestion to a requirement. And this line here, okay, 4 to 6 pages. All right, got that. Cross it off. We're good with that. And we'll take out the points things here. Now, some people prefer to just outright delete these. I prefer crossing off because it gives a great visual indicator of what's still left to be done. All right, so let's look at this. And we can see, for example, here, select 3 structures. Okay, so we're going to need structure 1. And this is before you decide on the specific one. You know that there's going to be 3 structures because you're required for that. So let's go ahead and put in a placeholder. And it should be followed by a solution for structure 1. Now, we're not trying to plug in the content right now. What we're trying to do is to create a roadmap for the things that you need to describe and to get a sense for how much space you're going to be using. Because this is a 4 to 6 page paper, and you may find that after you do exactly what's specified, there may be more space or not a lot at all. So looking at this, okay, let's say you're going to describe the conflict. And I'm just going to throw in a why solving this is important. And you could even go in and say, okay, whose because we know we're going to need that information. So as soon as you decide it, you can slot it in there, and then you can form that into a sentence later. All right, looking at this next one, we have the central principles. Okay. And which principles we're taking, I don't know yet, but the wording is going to look something like this, so I can start writing that out. And include citations for key terms that you're defining, so it's clear how you are using them. So you've got a list of things to do. Probably going to spend around a page and a half max on this section. So just looking at this, these should have more than a couple sentences of discussion each, perhaps a short paragraph or so. And see, alternate plan. Alright, so looking at this, we've gone through and come up with a preliminary list of here are things that we know from the instructions should be in the paper. Now you can go back and go through the scenarios that you're considering and go back through the reading and add some more detail as you make these decisions. I'm going to insert an artificial description here just to illustrate some of the points. So let's say that the identified conflict here is executive leadership succession in a large nonprofit. And we're going to locate this in central Nebraska. So here, the conflict that I've defined it is they're trying to hire a new executive leader, but they just can't agree. They're split 50-50, no one's budging. Context: longtime founder has retired. Interim has been at the helm for, let's say, 16 months. So basically setting up, okay, what's happened around this? And perspectives, well, in this case, my perspectives are going to be the two sides that are split here, and what do they want? Who are they backing? And so that might be local candidate. Now, you might find that you start putting notes in some place here, like this one here, and see, oh, well, actually, here's why solving this is important, and actually, this is going to be really important down here. And there may be other things that you choose to put in as well. All right. So the exact details are going to depend on what the case that you end up describing. I would say make sure, in part because you've done up this list, make sure that it has all the elements that you are required to write about. Make sure that it's something that you're interested about, that you have, I would say, a personal or professional interest in understanding how this type of situation might be worked out, because that will keep you more engaged and it'll make sure you are looking for those practical applications that it does come down to. All right, how can you resolve this, and how, through this connection to the global context, how is this indicative of how problems might be solved in the larger world, because it connects to that larger world. So I hope that's helpful. Let us do a quick recap and then wrap things up. So we started out by discussing the purpose of case studies and case studies. We discussed the specific assignment under the microscope, Leadership 724's Week 7 case study assignment. We looked at some key content, aspects of the course reading that are specifically referenced in the assignment, and we finished with drafting and outlining, talking about how to take the assignment instructions and create a guide to what you should be writing, and a list, if you will, of specific things that should go in there in order to receive full credit. And we finished with the hands-on, looking at how to go from the instructions to filling in some details, including a demonstration of a sample where we're writing a case study about succession in a nonprofit organization. If you are hoping to get help from the Writing Center on something, perhaps you are writing a draft of this very assignment and you'd like to get feedback, you can schedule an appointment online, send us an email at onlinewritingcenter@ACU, or visit the Online Writing Center website for the recording for this, templates, special explorations of different topics in our blog posts, and many more things. And with that, have a good night.